This is Duke University.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Eric Myers. I'm co-director of the Center for Jewish Studies, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here for the annual Rudnick Lectureship. The Rudnick Lectureship has been generously endowed by David L. Rudnick of New York City and Palm Beach, Florida, to promote an open discussion about Israel and world affairs. Previous speakers have included Shimon Peres, David Ellenson, president of Hebrew Union College, Arnold Eisen, president of the Jewish Theological Seminary, Jonathan Sachs, chief rabbi of the United Kingdom, Elie Wiesel, and most recently Isaac Herzog of the government of Israel. We're happy to announce that this spring we will have a second Rudnick lecture, and that will be Ambassador Thomas Pickering, former Deputy Director of State and a close friend of Carol's and mine, and a wonderful speaker. I want to make an announcement about a follow-up to this evening's program that has been organized by undergraduates. For all our students in the audience this evening, we would like to announce that a follow-up to tonight's lecture will be happening on November 18th at 6 p.m. A roundtable discussion of questions brought up by this lecture will be moderated by Professor Philip Bennett, Eugene Patterson Professor of the Practice of Public Policy. Students are asked to come prepared with their questions raised by tonight's lecture and to engage in an academic and thoughtful discussion. Please visit the Jewish Studies website for further information about this follow-up event. And now let me present the presenter and introducer, Bruce Gentleson, who is a co-founder of Bridging the Gap Project, promoting greater policy relevance among academics, among many other things. He has served as a senior foreign policy advisor to Vice President Al Gore in 2000, in the Clinton administration of the State Department, and as a foreign policy aide to Senator Gore and David Durenberger. He has also served on a number of policy commissions, most recently the Responsibility to Protect Working Group, co-chaired by Madeleine Albright. And I'm delighted to present Bruce, who is the first director of the Institute before this place became a school. Bruce.
Thanks very much, Eric, and thanks to the sponsors of the Rudnick Lecture. It's really my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this year, Ethan Bronner, who's had a very distinguished career in journalism. He is currently the deputy national editor of the New York Times, and prior to that has held many different positions for the Times, the Boston Globe, and Reuters, and particularly, I think, for our purposes tonight, was the Jerusalem bureau chief for the New York Times for many years. You've probably seen his writing. Recently, he had a very, what I thought, powerful op-ed talking about having covered this area and gotten to know the people from so many different angles, sort of the consequences of separation at a very human level for Palestinians and Israelis and how that's changed over time. And it reminded me of my own experience as a historian. In 1993-94, I was involved in one of the sets of peace talks, and we were meeting in Cairo at the Cairo Hilton, right on Tahrir Square, pre-Arab Spring by a number of years. And we were involved in these negotiations. They had to do with arms control and regional security in the region. It wasn't just Israel and the Palestinians. It was about 15 different Arab countries dealing with a whole range of issues in that particular policy area. And we'd been going at it for 3-4 days, you know, and people were yelling at each other and screaming at each other. And we had about a 12-hour day, and we're up on whatever the top floor was, I don't know, 40th floor or something. And we suddenly see this smoke coming up, what we thought was smoke. Everybody kind of panics. And runs down the stairs. But all those people that had been screaming and yelling at each other took each other's hands and took each other by the arm and helped each other down the stairs, because even with their differences, they had not had separation. They got to know each other. We got to the bottom, we found out that we'd forgotten, some of us didn't know, that it was the night before Ramadan started, and there's always a lot of weddings. And it was the dry ice coming up through the chutes. But nevertheless, the moment was significant for what can happen when people really are able to spend time with each other. And I think the op-ed he wrote just struck me at the time as really speaking to that aspect of the issue. He's agreed to speak for about 40 minutes and then take questions for a while. So when we do get to the questions, there's microphones up top. There's one here, and we'll ask you, he'll take his own questions, to introduce yourself and then pose the question, he'll respond. So please join me in welcoming to Duke, Ethan Bronner.
Thank you, Bruce, and thank you, Eric. And I've been here a couple of times before, but it's great to be back. I was about to take my watch off, but I see I have a clock there. It's an old rabbi joke about taking your watch off that goes like this. Some non-Jew comes into a synagogue and asks a lot of things he doesn't understand, and he says, what's that? That's a kippah, that's a talit. And what does it mean when the rabbi takes his watch off? It doesn't mean a damn thing. So anyway. I just heard it the other day. I had to share it. I'm sorry. So I thought I would start with the end of my tour, which is just a little more than 2 years ago when it ended, and bring you in a little bit to my life and my work there, and then expand out to where we are today. When I finished in the spring of 12, I wanted to do what Times correspondents have done, I don't know, for 20 or 30 years, which is to hold a goodbye party and a hello party. Hello for Jody Rudoran, who was coming to replace me, and goodbye to me. And, it's one of those moments when you can bring Palestinians and Israelis together into one place because you've been dealing with them, and you have that possibility. So we sent out about 100 or 150 invitations, and the place we chose was across from the King David Hotel in West Jerusalem. And the Israelis started responding, we're coming, and there wasn't a single Palestinian response. And then at a certain point, I got a call from Hassan Khatib, who at that time was the spokesman of the Palestinian Authority government, and he said, Ethan, we'd love to come say goodbye and to meet Jody, but you're holding it in Jerusalem, and for us to come to Jerusalem, we have to get special permission from the Israelis, and we're not willing to ask. This is something that began in the fall of 11 when the Palestinians decided to upgrade their status at the UN. One of the ways in which the Israelis took retaliation was to remove the VIP cards from almost everybody in the government. So he said, but you know what, why don't we have a party for you, a goodbye, hello party in Ramallah, and we can do it there. I said, that's a great idea. Okay, we'll set one up in Ramallah, and I organized it with our Ramallah stringer to do it there. And then he called a couple of days later, and he said, you know what, I don't really want to yield Jerusalem to the Jews. I think there should be a Palestinian goodbye party in Jerusalem as well. I said, okay, we'll have a Palestinian goodbye party in Jerusalem. So we were about to have 3 goodbye parties, which we did, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about each one of them to show you what we're up against and what the situation is these days. So the first one, in fact, as it happened chronologically, was the one in Jerusalem. And it was held at an institute called PASIA, which stands for something like Palestinian Association for the Study of International Affairs. I think that's it. And it's run by a guy named Mahdi Abdelhadi, who is no lover of Zion and no lover of Fatah. He's kind of an independent crank. I don't mean he's crazy, I just mean he's sort of cranky. And he had once asked me actually to speak there before, and then I had agreed to do so, and then it was the day that Gilad Shalit was released in Gaza, and I had to cancel. So it turned out, though, that one of the things that Mahdi was trying to do was to reach out to some of the more radical younger Palestinians and bring them to the Institute. And one of the ways to do that was to have sort of the bait of a nice Jewish boy from the New York Times. I didn't know that at the time. So there was a kind of on the web an internal discussion among them about whether they should come, shouldn't they boycott it, and they decided they would come, and they did. I mean, about 6 or 10 of them came. And I got sort of 30 or 50 seconds into my talk, and one of them stood up and said, why should we listen to anything you say when the New York Times is just a Zionist propaganda rag? And I said, well, I mean, have you read it? I mean, are there articles that you can point to that you're particularly upset by? I said, I don't have to read it. I know what it is. And I said, well, I mean, that seems a little bit, unfair. But and then a next guy stood up and said to me, are you proud of your son? So you may or may not recall that in '09, my younger son decided to sign up for the Israeli army while I was a correspondent there, which was not a particularly happy event for me. It was a big pain in my neck, but he was 20. He had a right to do what he wanted to do, and I wasn't going to interfere. And my editors said, okay, you continue to do your work, and it's okay. And so so that's what he asked me at that point. And I said, and actually, my kid had already left Israel and left the army, but I said, my relationship with my son is kind of between him and me. He said, are you proud of your son? I said, I'm proud of my son. So 8 guys stood up and walked out. That was the first goodbye party number 1, right? The second one was in Ramallah, and I went there with Jody and with Isabel Kirshner, who's the number 2 in the Bureau, and Rina Castelnuovo, who's the photographer of the Bureau. And so there are different ways, there are 2 or 3 ways to get to Ramallah from Jerusalem. We chose the simplest way, which turned out to be a bad idea on that day because, and in that sense it's worth lingering on for a minute, we went through Kalandia, and it's a place where there's a fair amount of Israeli military activity at times, and in fact, this was such a day. We were simply unable to move. We were stuck behind 100 cars, and it was getting late. It was the time of the party was getting past. We eventually sort of ditched our car and ran, and got there like a half an hour to 45 minutes late, and the hummus had that kind of brown crusted thing going on. And it was not a happy, I mean, people were nice and everything, but it was very sad, really, to not be able to get in or out because of this, which is, of course, the situation for thousands of Palestinians every day faced with this kind of checkpoint situation. So that was party number 2, and its own value. And party number 3 was the original one that we had planned at this venue in West Jerusalem. It's a spot right across from it's right next to the YMCA if you've been to Jerusalem. It was at many times a crappy restaurant. It turned itself into a kind of venue. And it was pretty good with, lots, it was very Israeli, very contemporary Israeli with delicious little, Asian sandwich things and, fantastic boutique wines. This is what Israel has become, a very wealthy and very sophisticated place in a lot of ways. And there were all these people. Now, and there were almost no Palestinians, but there were about 4. But I'm going to tell you about 2 of them. The one of them was our Gaza stringer, fixer, translator, right? We have such a person in Gaza and such a person on the West Bank. And his name is Faris Akram. And, he amazingly was able to come to the party. The military doesn't let people out of Gaza unless they're dying and need to go to a hospital. But I had asked permission, and they had agreed to let him come out for a few days for this transition in the Bureau. And there he was. And when it became known that there was a Palestinian from Gaza in the room, it became kind of a bit of a thing. For some, there was Dan Meridor, he was a minister at the time, and there was a guy with, the little security guys with their things like this, all kind of standing around. And we didn't have a metal detector to get into the party, so there was, and then different people. Herzog, who spoke here, Isaac Herzog was there, and they kind of went up to him and to talk to him. They had no idea what life was like in Gaza. They have no access to life in Gaza anymore. As officials, there's no coverage of Gaza, really, in the Israeli press and media. Israelis are not allowed to go. So it was kind of, a very powerful thing to sort of watch these grown people stand around and ask him what life was like. And he's a very engaging guy. Speaks pretty good English, and is actually studying Hebrew. But anyway, so the second Palestinian I want to tell you about is Khalid Abu Akr, who was our West Bank stringer. He's no longer. He has moved on, and someone else is doing the job in the last 6 months, but he had been it for about 10 years for us. And he's a Jerusalem Palestinian, right? So there are 5 kinds of Palestinians. There are the 48 Palestinians, meaning those who live in Israel, who are Israeli citizens. There are West Bank Palestinians. There are Gaza Palestinians. There are Jerusalem Palestinians, and those guys have blue IDs, which means that they're allowed to move around within Israel, although they're not citizens. And then there are diaspora Palestinians who live in camps and who may live in Raleigh-Durham. So Khalid was there, and one of the things that both Khalid and Faris have in common is that both of their fathers died at the hands of the Israeli security forces. Khalid's father, in 1970, was one of the first Fatah activists picked up by the Israelis and died in prison. Khalid says he was tortured to death. It could well be. I've never reported it out. I don't know. And Faris's father was killed by a stray shell in the 08-09 war operation in Gaza. He was, in fact, a Fatah activist himself. And he wasn't the aim of there was an attempt to kill him, but he died. So, I mean, here we had the 2 guys that I spent most of my time with when I was in the Palestinian territories, both of whom died at the hands of the security service that my kid had joined. And the thing that was so interesting to me was that the 3 of us knew that we were linked together in the search for truth, in an attempt to find journalism and produce it as best we could. And there was no ideological issue among us. We wanted to get the story as we understood it, and we understood it in a common way. But I think we also understood something else, which is that the likelihood of those kinds of relationships in Israel and Palestine today are increasingly uncommon, and you almost never have people collaborating like that anymore across those lines, and it's a terribly tragic thing. I mean, it's the thing that I did write about this past summer that Bruce mentioned, and it's something that I have observed because I have been going as a reporter to Jerusalem for 30 years. So my first tour was in the mid-'80s for Reuters. My second tour was for the Boston Globe in the first half of the 90s, and then from 08 to 12 for the Times. And I can sort of measure the arc of mutual disdain by examining these 3 decades. And when I first got there in '83 as a reporter, if you were a Gazan, you could get in your car. It's true you had a little blue license plate, but you could get in your car and you could drive to Tel Aviv for dinner and you would not meet a single checkpoint. Nobody would stop you and say, "What are you doing here?" Because that was occupation, real occupation, as some people like to say. And it was also before the level of security concerns grew. Saab Erekat, who's he has the title Chief Palestinian Negotiator. I'm not sure what they're negotiating anymore, but he's had that title for many years. Quite a charming guy. Was the editorial page editor of Al-Quds newspaper in the 80s before he went into the negotiation and governing game. And he's from Jericho, and he used to say to me, I used to be able to get in my car with my wife and go somewhere, and now I can't go anywhere, so do me a favor, occupy me again, okay? I want to be... obviously, it was a bitter sense of humor on his part, but what he's saying is, I can't stand the life that has come to me through all of this wonderful negotiation, and I am sympathetic. I also, as a reporter in those years, '83 through '5, could and did drive my car to the northern border of Israel, call the UN, and walk across the Lebanese border and then take a cab to Sidon or to Beirut, right? Unimaginable today. Unimaginable today. If you've been, you know that there are barriers and walls and electronic fences and so forth all over the place. You know, look, my point of this story is not to say there's no excuse, then they shouldn't do it. I'm not saying that. I mean, there are reasons these things happen. There were terrible security concerns. There were two intifadas, and the PLO became supporting of Iraq during the 1991 war and danced on the roofs when there were Scuds coming. And so, I mean, there are reasons that these things happen. There's plenty of blame to go around. I'm not blaming only one side. But in terms of the experience of people there, it has become really pretty rough in terms of any effort to cross. The other thing is that the relationship between Palestinians and Israelis in those years, the 80s and the 90s, was so different from what it is today. In those years, there were tens of thousands of Palestinians who worked in Israel every day. At the height, there were something like 150,000 Palestinians working every day in Israel. Some of them would quietly spend the night in Israel, even though they officially weren't supposed to, but nobody really cared. And the result of all of that encounter was real relationships and also lots of Palestinians who spoke Hebrew and who understood, each side understood that the other was made up of human beings with real concerns. You know, in those days, if you were a Palestinian on a construction site in Tel Aviv and your kid was going to get married in Hebron, you might well invite your foreman, who's Israeli, to come to the wedding, and he might well go. And those kinds of relationships led to all sorts of things. If your guy who was fixing your porch couldn't show up because they had closed the place down, you understood that somebody was suffering, somebody wasn't earning money, somebody's family wasn't getting the money they needed, and you cared. All of that's gone today. You know, so that the only Israelis that Palestinians in the West Bank see today are either settlers or soldiers with guns. And, you know, Palestinians have decided, I mean, I think both sides have sort of decided that separation is the way forward. So Israel has the power and creates the separation, and the Palestinians, through their political movement, have created a BDS movement in order to boycott, divest from, and impose sanctions on anything Israeli. And that sort of shade of BDS is partly what was going on for my goodbye parties, and partly, of course, and I'm sure you feel it in an academic community here as well. And the Israelis, of course, have also put Palestinians out of their minds. There was a war this summer, and Israeli TV did show what was happening in Gaza to some extent, but fundamentally, there is just no thought in Israel today about what's going on in Gaza. It's an enormous welfare state with no chance of economic development. And it's basically a result of Israeli policy, not exclusively, but basically. And, you know, again, there is a rationale for this policy. The Hamas, which runs Gaza, is not exactly a Zionist organization. And, you know, the decision was made that by squeezing Hamas and Gaza, that this was a way of sort of sending a message and imposing the appropriate policy. I mean, as a reporter and an editor, it's not my job to pass judgment on it, at least not publicly. But the real question is, you know, is it doing Israel any good, and is it doing the Palestinians any good? One thing I would say also that I found during my years there, and I have found since, is that because there's so much stagnation in this conflict, because in some ways I could take stories that I wrote for Reuters in 1984 and put them in the paper today, and you would not know the difference, because the same issues are still there. Many of the same actors are still there too. That there's so much energy around this conflict among readers and among actors that the sense is that nothing's happening, so it must be that the story's not being told properly. So there's an incredible amount of attention on the narrator, on the reporter, on the person who tells the story, this sense on both sides that if only you told the story right, policy would adjust and everything would be fine. We would be able to get done what we needed to get done if only you told the right story. And, in fact, as a reporter in that place, it's quite a remarkable set of experiences because everything is so tiny, so close. I remember talking to an Egyptian diplomat, his first visit to Jerusalem, and he went and he looked at the Jordan River, which is narrower than this room in many places, and he said to me, "That's it? That's the Jordan River?" It's like, are you kidding me? This place is a joke. And the truth is, everything is so close that, a typical reporting day for me might be to go to a settlement on the West Bank and listen to the Israelis who live there complain about the violent tendencies of their Palestinian neighbors, and then half an hour later go to the Palestinian village and listen to their complaints about their Israeli neighbors. It's almost head spinning that there is such a sense of difference of narrative between the two sides. And I had this with my kid's Army service, by the way. So, there'd be an event where they go to the Western Wall and they play big loud music and everyone has got tears in their eyes and a tikvah is playing and they're given their Bibles and their guns. And I go there to watch, and then 5 minutes later, I'm walking 3 streets down to a Palestinian literary festival whose entire theme is get these people out of here. And I know it sounds like a kind of recipe for schizophrenia, but the truth is I really liked it. And unless you're the sort of person who really does enjoy, in a slightly cold-blooded fashion, to observe the passions of others, this may not be the job for you, in case any of you were thinking about it. And I also really have always enjoyed testing assumptions through this kind of constant interaction of various narratives. And also, of course, I believe that one of the great functions of foreign journalism is it helps you examine yourself, right? When you see, or your own, when you see how people live, when you see how they handle issues and problems elsewhere, it helps you think about your own. One of the things I've always loved is something that James Baldwin said when he spent, 10 or 15 years in France. Being gay and black in the 50s wasn't so easy in America. And he went over, and when he came back, someone said, "Why did you leave?" He said, "I didn't leave. I just went over to the other side to get a better view." And, I feel that way too, to some extent, about the privilege of being a foreign correspondent. I can also tell you a little bit more about my own relationship to all of these issues for a few minutes. I think it's of some interest, which is that, as I said, this was not my first tour in Israel in 08-12 now. And when my son decided to join the Army, he wasn't the first person I ever met in my family or elsewhere with an Israeli uniform on. I'm married to an Israeli. B, both my parents have tons of relatives in Israel. And I've seen my wife's, all 3 of her brothers in uniform. And actually, on my mother's side, there are people who were settlers in Gaza, settlers in the West Bank. And on my father's side, there were people who refused military service. So and went to prison for it. So, I've really kind of seen and I've been in touch with a wide range of people for a long time throughout the military. And I can tell you that, familiarity does not necessarily breed love, right? One of my cousins, a dear cousin, was one of the very first conscientious objectors in Israel in 1966, before the occupation. He didn't say, "I'm opposed to the occupation." He said, "I'm opposed to a military. I don't want that. There shouldn't be a military in this country." And his father had been a diplomat. He'd lived in the States during some key years of the mid-'60s. But they had no means of handling this assertion. The psychiatrists and the generals would look at him and they'd say, "What?" He'd say, no, I don't think that we should have a military. They would, what? And they didn't know whether to put him in a hospital or a prison. And eventually, there was a kind of off-the-books deal that allowed him to work with Arab children in Haifa as his alternative service, but it was not an official thing. It was just something that they allowed. And I have other relatives who have another guy named Yigal Bronner, shares my last name, is very involved in the BDS movement and in the refusal to serve in the military. So, it's not, and I have another cousin, in all of these stories I'm telling you, there are people in this room who know exactly what I'm telling you about, by the way. So another cousin of mine was in the paratroopers and would come to my house for Friday night dinner sometimes and would say to me, I can't tell you how ashamed I am that my fellow soldiers are looting the houses that we are inspecting in the West Bank. I can't tell you how horrible it is. So all of which is to say that, it doesn't necessarily have to be that if you have a link to the military that you're going to be softer on it or have a different view of it. I also remember once I was asked to give a talk to incoming cadets at the military in Israel. They were all going to work for the spokesman's units, the people who deal with journalists. And I remember talking about my work, and a young woman stood up and she said, I don't understand. You are Jewish. How do you allow yourself to write articles that reflect poorly on Israel? Aren't you think that you're betraying your people? And I said, we all have different functions in life. Your job is to advocate, and I respect that job. My job is to seek the truth. I may fail at it, but that's how I see my job. And I believe, as deeply as I can believe, that the task of truth-seeking will serve my people, okay? Because I think as long as there is truth, if this cause is just, it will be fine, and if it isn't, we'll see. So I feel like I am serving my people. She said, that was the phrase she used. Shouldn't you be serving your people? So, I said my people are basically journalists, by the way. So, that's the other thing. When I was over there in Jerusalem, I came here, and I used to come to a number of places. I used to come back to see my family and the paper, and I would often give talks to groups. And before I took one of these trips, an Israeli friend of mine said, so you are going to give some speeches to Americans. Whom are you speaking to? I said, well, I speak to Jewish groups, I speak to undergraduates, I speak to community centers. So he sort of grabs me and he says, well, you tell those undergraduate students that Israel is not a racist, fascist, apartheid state. I said, okay, I'll do that. And what shall I tell the Jews? He said, tell the Jews it is. And this is a true story. And he's not some lunatic. He's got a good sense of humor, admittedly. But the point of this, the reason I repeat the story to you, apart from its generally amusing nature, is that, it's true. You can tell the story either way. There are so many things that have happened in this conflict that you can absolutely build a narrative with each one of those convictions. And I felt that my job over there, because as I said, I don't think the story had moved all that much fundamentally in these years, and because it has been told so skillfully by so many of my predecessors, and not just New York Times reporters, God knows how many people are telling this story thoughtfully, that I felt like my job was somehow to take this increasingly ossified debate, this black and white phenomenon, and try to inject elements of gray into it. And so, in other words, if you were someone who was absolutely convinced that the only way that a Jewish state would survive in the Middle East is if it got out of the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem and built a Palestinian state, and then everything was going to be fine, that I wanted to introduce you to elements of the story, characters, narrative lines, historical context that would make you challenge yourself and say, well, maybe that won't necessarily work out. Or, by contrast, if you were someone who said, no matter what the Jews do, they will never be accepted. Again, I wanted to introduce thoughts and stories to make you ask yourself that. And, one of the great advantages of journalism over academia is the stories are powerful. They're very powerful. And they, good academics tell stories too, don't get me wrong. But I mean, that's sort of what sets journalism apart. And so I felt that my job was to deal in gray in this black, and I can tell you that if you, in a black and white world, when you try to deal in gray, it's a good way to get everyone to hate you, and there, I do think I had a measure of success. Every foreign correspondent has more than one story to tell, and they often contradict one another. The correspondent in Rio also has to deal with Argentina, and the Argentinians and the Brazilians are not exactly close lovers. And, the correspondent in Rome has to deal with Greece and Spain. So it's not so unusual, but in the case of Jerusalem, it's incredible what a gap there is between the two-side story. It's not just that they don't agree, it's that they contradict each other at every single turn. Every single term, every single event is told and viewed differently. This makes for a very difficult issue. Right now, for example, there is a growing controversy over this elevated plaza in the old city of Jerusalem that the Jews call the Temple Mount, and that Muslims call the Noble Sanctuary, the Haram al-Sharif. And as a writer, you don't know really what to call it. I mean, for years, the Times just called it the Temple Mount because it's sort of what the Jews call it, and by the way, it's kind of what the Christians call it. So the idea that, you had to give equal billing to what the Muslims called it wasn't so obvious for some years. But one of the things that has happened in the last 10 or 15 years is that Muslims and Palestinians have learned to negotiate with the press and to create a narrative and to seek equal play. And now we say the holy spot that the Jews call and that the Muslims call, right? Because there's extra words, which we hate, because you always have word limits on your stories and you want to tell some interesting stuff in it, but you don't know what else to do. I mean, in all honesty, I don't know what's the fair way to go. I mean, if it's a popularity contest, there's almost 2 billion Muslims, and there are, 750 Jews in the world, so that's not going to work for the Jews. If it's who was there first, who was there longer, so it's tough. And the same thing with that thing that the Israelis have been building since 2002 or 2003 that goes along and inside the West Bank that the Palestinians call a wall because that sounds aggressive, and the Israelis call a fence because that sounds neighborly, and that the New York Times calls a barrier because we hope it doesn't sound like anything. But, it's very, very hard to know what is appropriate and what are you evoking. And when you use language, of course, there's force behind language. If you talk about a terrorist, if you talk about a wall sounds horrible. And there are wall elements. By the way, of the 400 whatever kilometers of that thing, probably 5% is wall. But much of it's in Jerusalem, which is where you see it, and it's sort of rough to see, and it makes you feel bad. So all Palestinians always call it a wall all the time. Right? All the time. It's a wall, 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 wall. But, is that right? Well, I mean, their problem isn't to be right. They've got their issues. But that's my problem. So I don't call it a wall. The other thing I would say is that Jews, Israel advocates, feel that the Times and the press is anti-Israel. And I don't accept that. I don't think that's true. Palestinians, by the way, feel the same way, as you know, certainly from the story I told, but anyway, you doubtless know. And what I would say is that it's not Israel that gets a bad press. It's basically everybody gets a bad press. I mean, the point of journalism is to really talk about problems. It's not to tell good stories, happy stories. That's not what we do. We don't, in New York, we don't tell you about the million people who went to work and went home and had dinner with their families. No, we tell you about the guy who got shot in the head and got thrown in the East River. That's what we write about. And it's the same. We were only in Jerusalem because of the conflict. We're not there. You know, the Israelis say, why don't you write about our scientific developments? I say, well, that's not what I'm here for. You know, I'm here to cover the conflict. And it's hard for people to grasp that, but that's what journalism really focuses on. It's about tension and problems. And I think it's also hard for people to get it. I mean, it's also hard for people to believe that there are people who don't feel so strongly as they do about everything. And the idea of seeking neutrality strikes them as crazy. Years ago, when I was on the foreign desk and we were this wall barrier fence thing, we were just working it out, actually. And I gave a talk at an Orthodox synagogue in Westchester, north of New York City. A tennis partner of mine was a member there. So I agreed to go talk, and I did. And I went through the wall barrier fence story, and when it was over, a woman came up to me and started asking me a question, and in my response, I used the word barrier, and she starts pointing at me like this. She says, fence. You're talking to a fence person now. She didn't, yeah, right? The world is divided between those who believe in fences and those who believe in walls. Nobody believes in barriers. So I'll try to also spend a few minutes now talking about the conflict itself, although I have to warn you that I'm not an advocate. I believe it's important that I not come to strong conclusions about the conflict as a reporter and an editor, not an opinion writer. I can tell you that when I was over there from 2008 to 2012, John Kerry was not the Secretary of State, but the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate, and would come over, and we would meet, not every time he came. I don't mean to suggest enormous intimacy, but we did sit down together several times during my years there. And I remember saying to him, you know, I don't think that either side is really up for any kind of major negotiation. I just don't feel it. I feel that I mean, it's a slightly heartless thing to say, but that neither side is sort of suffering enough to really make the sacrifices that are necessary from itself to really come to a deal that the other side could accept. And I remember feeling his saying, no, that's not true at all. I feel that this can be done. And, you know, I wasn't shocked when he became Secretary of State and made it a very important object of his to do something about this. And, you know, look, it was a totally honest, serious endeavor, and I take my hat off to him. But, again, in a purely cold-blooded way, you do have to ask yourself, did he make it worse? I mean, you know, there's a price to failure. If you, in fact, don't know that things are going to work out, and you decide to bring everybody to a brink, on some level, there's a price to be paid when you fail. And I think that that's not a discussion that's been had enough. Maybe it's inevitable that you don't have such a discussion. I mean, trying for something that seems fairly straightforward is something we can all admire, but nonetheless, I thought I'd throw it out there. I also feel that what happened this summer was, you know, very complex and messy business in terms of what led to this Gaza war. There was this kidnapping of 3 young Israelis in the West Bank. And, you know, that set off a lot of things. And it's an interesting development because you have the 3 of them are effectively settlers. And the kidnapping of them, or the abduction of them, kidnapping is an odd word, the abduction of them is, you know, who carried it out? Well, we think we know now, but was it ordered by Hamas? So the Israeli argument, the Israeli government argument, and I am not in a position to contradict it, is that even though it wasn't ordered officially by Hamas, it was a Hamas operation, and it was Hamas trying to sort of begin to impose its will on the West Bank. And therefore, we had to come down hard. I'm telling you what they believe, and at least what they say. I think they probably believe it. But the result was rounding up a lot of these guys who had been released in the Gilad Shalit exchange, by the way, a lot of them Hamas people who had not, as it were, done anything wrong since their release, and then beginning a lot of attacks in Gaza, which eventually led, now, is that what caused the rockets to come flying back at Israel? It's a legitimate argument. On the other hand, we do know that Hamas was in a very, very desperate straits. It had lost the Muslim Brotherhood's in Egypt support. It had lost a lot of financial support. The tunnels, which was a great source of income for them because they controlled all the trafficked goods that were trafficked through them, had been closed by the Egyptians. And, it didn't look good for them. So the Israeli argument, again, is they were looking for a moment to take advantage of, to start shooting rockets. And they did, and then we had to go in and stop it. To go back to the competitive narrative question, I did an event at a New York synagogue last week with an Israeli who he was complaining about how we tell our stories. Factually, what's in the New York Times is true, but there's no context. You don't tell us that X happened or Y happened. And so he began to talk about the Gaza war, and he said, the rockets began to rain down. And I said, wait a minute, that's where the story starts? The rockets began to rain down? I mean, maybe, but there got to be 10 other places you could start this story. And that's what I'm trying to relay to you today, that, in fact, I think a lot of what happened in the weeks and months before those rockets were very significant. And in addition, the attempt by Hamas and Fatah to form, once again, a unity government, which is probably doomed. I mean, one of the reasons, if there's any ounce of optimism left in any of you about this conflict, that I would urge you to get rid of it, is that both sides are deeply troubled. I mean, the ability of Hamas and Fatah to get along is, the other day, all these Fatah guys, their cars were blown up. They just canceled the Arafat memorial service in Gaza. Hamas is not interested in a deal, and I'm not sure Fatah is. They hate each other almost as much as they hate the other guys. And again, I would say to you that the Israeli attempt to build up Fatah, build up the Palestinian Authority, has been, not very serious. An example that comes to my mind that really lived through me when I was there is there's a Palestinian town, doesn't yet exist, called Rawabi, which is basically a Yuppieville is the plan, 8 miles north of Ramallah. The guy who's planning it is a man named Bashar al-Masri, who is, as Americanized as you can imagine. He has like a Jewish architect from New York, and he's trying to build, with cinemas and public squares, and trying to build a modern Western place to have a middle-class Palestinian population. And he's been at it for 7 or 8 years. And when I arrived in February of 2008, and I went to see Tony Blair, he remains the quartet's representative to the peace process, to the Palestinians. So he said to me, they're trying to build the city of Rawabi, and Masri just needs a little road to allow it to be so that people can get in and out. And the Israelis have not granted it. And by the way, they've still not granted it. Here we are, 7 years later, they've still not granted it. And there's no water going from it that they need to make this place work. So, when you want to see, are they really helping economic development, because that's their policy, unfortunately, I'm sorry to say that much of it is not going on at all. When I think about the situation in Gaza, one of the things that I asked Prime Minister Netanyahu, again, I don't mean to suggest some incredible relationship, but I did have the chance to sit with him a few times alone. And one time I said to him, I don't understand about you and Gaza in the following way. This is also a sort of a Blair and a State Department assertion that why don't you build up the business class, the merchant class in Gaza, allow for trade, because that would form a kind of natural counterforce to Hamas, which relies on misery for its relatively extreme perspective. I said, Mr. Prime Minister, you are Mr. Markets, you're the guy who reformed Israeli, from a state-heavy, you believe in the power of markets. Why don't you believe in the power of markets in Gaza? So he said to me, I kind of agree with you. You have a point. I think there's something to what you say, but my security guys won't let me do it. And I tell you that story partly because if you've seen the movie The Gatekeepers, and you sit there and you start swaying religiously, yeah, these guys are right. And what are these guys saying? They have 6 former heads of the Shin Bet, all saying, we need a political development, political arc for the West Bank, and the problem is that the political establishment doesn't have the guts to do it. And what I learned from that conversation with Netanyahu is nobody has the guts to do it. The political guys blame the security guys blame the political guys, because nobody wants people to die on their watch. And people are likely to die when you make big policy changes. So I feel like I have very little hope for any major change coming. There right now in the news in the last few days, and I'll end with this, and we'll go to questions. There has been a fair amount of small activity. An Israeli Arab who was accused of having stabbed a policeman or tried to, and then there was a man from Nablus at the bus station in Tel Aviv, and so there have been a kind of lots of little points of anger and of terrorism, if you like, in Israel and in the West Bank in the last few days, and there is talk of a third intifada, right? Will this create a third intifada? I can't know, believe me, I can't know, but I will say this and end it with that. When the second intifada occurred, Israel had withdrawn almost entirely from the West Bank cities. It had, after Rabin was assassinated, and we're on the 19th anniversary just a few days ago, Peres took over and he gave back the cities to the PA, to the Palestinian Authority, and pulled the Israeli troops out. And that was in 95, early 96, late 95. And then in 2000, an uprising occurred, and the Israelis' military and security forces had no real hold on the place. And they had to, from their perspective, of course, really claw their way back in, which they did in 02, 03, fairly brutally. But hundreds of Israelis, of course, were dying at the hands of Palestinian bombers. And so, anyway, they went in and they took over. And my observation from my years there is that while they are not officially in the cities during the day, they let the Palestinian Authority forces run the place, they have an enormous amount of control, enormous. And they go in every night and they arrest people and they search for arms. And I would think that to organize an intifada will take more than is likely to be available on the ground right now. I don't say that that's bad news or good news. I'm just giving you my sense. Thank you very much. So we have, 20 minutes or something? And I'm happy to take questions about anything, more or less anything. Yeah, so I think you have to go to a microphone. Is that right, Professor Friedman? There's a microphone in the back. It's pretty annoying, I'm sorry. Maybe you should have somebody running around with it. No? Maybe you'll let him ask and then you'll ask next. You did that Reagan thing. You got the mic. Yeah, right. But
what a hopeful picture.
yeah, thanks, I know. I'm here to bring good news.
Can you think of, or do you fantasize about, any possible outside catalyst to the players themselves that could possibly move things along, especially if it could come from the United States?
I mean, I think that as a matter of theory, yes, a very determined American government could probably force some kind of a deal, but but it would have to decide that it was going to, there'd be consequences for those who refusing to be part of the deal. And no American government in the current political makeup could do that. I mean, it's going to, because the power is in the hands of Israel. I'm not saying that the Palestinians have no power, but fundamentally, the Israelis are the ones who are going to have to yield, right? And if there's going to be a deal, they're going to have to get out of territories that they're in. They're going to have to allow a nation that they have control of to develop in ways that might frighten them, with whatever guarantees of security that might come along with that. And there is no American government that would be willing to really put the screws on Israel to do it. And again, I'm not here to say that's a bad thing. That's a judgment you'll have to make. But I can't see that happening.
Thank you.
So it sounded pretty pessimistic, talking about the West Bank and also the Gaza. I wanted to ask about the what you call the 1948 Palestinians.
Mm-hmm.
And in today's times, Prime Minister Netanyahu was sort of made a statement that, well, if they don't like the way we're doing things, they should try living under
Right.
the West Bank.
Let them move to Gaza.
Right, right, or the West Bank. And that was perceived by a number of commentators as representing a real break in an attitude of the Israeli government towards what you call the 48 Palestinians. And I was curious your thoughts about what's going to what might be going on with that relationship.
So I'm
Joel Rosh, I teach here at the Sanford School.
Nice to meet you. It's a very dynamic situation, and because I'm not on the ground right now, I would speak with caution about it. But on the other hand, it's something that has been underway for a period of time. My impression of Israeli Arabs, whatever we want to call them, Palestinians who are Israeli citizens, is that they are richer, better educated, better off, and angrier than ever in their history. And they go to Israeli universities and they get law degrees and PhDs, and then they form organizations to destroy the Jewish state. Destroy, I don't mean with arms, but I mean to undermine it and to create a different kind of state. I'm not here to say this is wrong, this is crazy, but that's a pattern that has developed. Adala and the organizations these are people who have benefited, if you like, and the Israeli Jews drives them crazy. So when Netanyahu speaks that way, it's a reflection of a sentiment. We gave them all, they don't love it, let them go to Gaza. You want to like it here, go there. There's a lot of that in Israel. It's so hard to fight racism in our society, which has officially got no master race, right? We're supposed to be all equal here, right? Imagine how hard it is to fight it in a place where there is it's a Jewish state. I mean, everyone's welcome, of course, but it's for us, okay? How hard it is to keep it up, a sense that, because there's the us and them thing in people is genetic. It's incredibly difficult to fight. So that has, sort of yielded in it, and unfortunately, it has gotten very ugly. There is a wonderful Israeli Arab writer, Sayed Kashua, fascinating guy who, he's from the village of Tira. Everything's a village, by the way. There are no Palestinian cities in Israel because they've never really been allowed to develop into cities, and there hasn't been a single new city for Palestinians in the nearly 70 years of the state's existence. So Sayed was brought to Jerusalem when he was 15 to be in an Israeli School of Arts and Sciences. He's a very, very brilliant guy. And he was educated effectively in Hebrew, and he became a writer in Hebrew. So he writes a column for Haaretz. He's written a couple of books. He's written a terrific TV show, which makes fun of Israeli attitudes toward Arabs. And he was given an appointment at the University of Illinois for this academic year. And he announced in his column over the summer that he's not coming back, that Israel is not a society that he wants his children to grow up in. Now, I don't really know whether Sayed can actually stay away because it's in his bloodstream. But he was very, very scared and upset this summer. Partly what happened is that he was getting threats, and he felt paranoid the way people get when they get threats. So it's not a but I'd say one other thing, which is that my own view of the situation of Israeli Arabs is that it is a problem, but it is nothing like the problem of Gaza and the West Bank. In other words, societies have their internal problems, and Israel has that, but it is not anything like the occupation problem, both in terms of how one could solve it and also in terms of its severity.
Can we take one quick follow-up here, and then we'll go upstairs for a question?
Okay?
Thank you. I wanted to follow up on your discussion of Israeli racism, and it's really the word racism that I wanted to ask you about. Those of us who study this part of the world know that this is not a new phenomenon, but what perhaps is new is the willingness to talk about it in the media, and I wondered if you could talk about that. And I'm particularly interested in your view from the Israeli media. And I was following the discussion and this particular language with regard to the events this summer, both the mobs hunting down Palestinians, chanting death to the Arabs in the streets this summer, but also the attacks on Israeli leftists. Can you comment on the discussion on that kind of extremist militant racism within Israeli society right now? And would you agree that there's a kind of a new willingness to come to terms with this phenomenon?
To come to terms with it, meaning to accept it?
To address it. No, not to accept,
it.
to address it and to debate it more openly.
I don't know. It's a very legitimate question. My own feeling is that, Jewish racist statements or attitudes toward Arabs go back a pretty long way in Israel. And in fact, non-Ashkenazi Jews were treated with a degree of contempt. It's been quite well documented in the last 20 or 30 years. My wife is a Yemeni Israeli, and it's completely real. So one of the problems is always where's the line that you draw to say, okay, from here we're going to judge how different it is? Because I would say an Arab in the 1950s or 60s in Israel was far worse off than an Arab today in Israel. So, there's something to what you say, but depends how big a perspective you want to give to it. I would also say that an Arab in Israel is luckier than many people in the world. It's just true. Luckier than many Arabs in many countries. How do you measure luck? Not having dignity can be a problem, admittedly, but having the ability to make a living, there are Arab doctors and Arab pharmacists and Arab lawyers. Absolutely, there are. And as I said, there's a fair amount of wealth there's enough wealth in Israel that it is affecting them as well, and wealth is an important start to a sense of security in life. So and your second point, which is that now the people are willing to deal with it in a way they weren't, I don't know that. I'm not sure why you say it. It sounds like, sorry? Well, Haaretz, I don't know. I feel like Haaretz has always been there for that matter, on that topic. I would have, if you would have said the opposite, I would have been easier for me to agree, which is that people's willingness to express anti-Muslim and anti-Arab sentiments without censure has grown in Israel. And this is not just because of the Gaza war. This is because of the volcano, which was an element I wanted to talk about, but worried about the time we didn't get to, which is Israel in the middle, as it views itself, of this volcano, right? Of the Arab uprising since January of 11 across the region. And the sense that, my God, look, they're all the same, ISIS, Hamas, we are just hanging on here, this, villa in a jungle, as Barak once said. So I don't know that there's a greater willingness to deal with it. Not sure. Yes.
I had a question. Actually, this is a good sequence. I am wondering, with all the talk about a possible nuclear Iran, and of course the fact that Iran is not itself Arab but Persian, what is the feeling within Israel, and how do you see the U.S. intermediating with all of that issue?
That's a huge question.
Yes.
So, in brief, the fact that they're not Arabs does not win them any points in Israel. I would say that. Iran has repeatedly raised questions about the legitimacy of Israel as a state. I mean, it's true that Rouhani is different from Ahmadinejad, but you know, the language has been pretty rough over the years, and there's also a fair amount of evidence of the sponsorship of anti-Israel terrorist activities by Iran. So Iran is the main patron both of Islamic Jihad in Gaza and of Hezbollah in Lebanon. So no love lost there. What it has created is a notion, probably an illusion, among the policymakers in Israel that they can form common cause with the Sunni Arab states against Iran. And you know, there is a very funny business with the sheikdoms and the Gulf kingdoms and so on and their relationship to Israel, because they will sort of, you know, pull Israeli diplomats aside in Paris and London at the UN and say, you know, I can't, you understand, and we're with you, man, we're with you. But, you know, but it means nothing. And it's a fascinating phenomenon, is never added up to anything. And it probably has to do with the Palestinian issue, but, you know, if you ask Netanyahu, he'll say to you that we could solve the Palestinian issue tomorrow and they'd still hate us. And that might be true. I mean, one of the things that's very hard to know is, you know, is there a way to fix this Rubik's Cube? It's not clear to me at all. So the American relationship to this Iranian bomb potential is also complicated by what's been happening in the last year with the attempt to fight ISIS, because of the fact that Iran could be a, you know, could help them with that. In theory, certainly the United States considers an Iranian bomb to be a terrible development, and not just because of its relationship with Israel, but because of what it would create in the region in terms of an arms race. And, you know, Obama has been on record a number of times saying, no way, we're never going to let that happen. You know, I mean, it's the thing is, what are you willing to do to prevent it from happening? And is it really happening? You know, these are enormously difficult challenges to know the answer to, not just for us, but for the people who officially are supposed to know in intelligence. I mean, I felt like what I learned in my time abroad talking to people in intelligence is that they didn't really know all that much, more than I did. I just wrote better.
Thanks.
Yes.
So my name's Courtney. I spent 3 months living in Israel this summer, so I kind of really lived through the conflict. And so I know I had a question about how you kind of worded the closing of the tunnels and the checkpoints. So you kind of spoke about it as being rough for the Palestinians, which I partially do understand, but I also was wondering if you saw any merit to the closing of the tunnels. I know you spoke about it being economically rough for the Palestinians, and the existence of checkpoints.
Right, I didn't mean that the closing of the tunnels was bad for the Palestinians. I said it was bad for Hamas, bad for the governing authority in Gaza, because they taxed the goods that came out of those tunnels, and they got rich off it. You know, I mean, it wasn't all corruption. They also did stuff with the money. But so that's what I meant to say, not that it was bad for the Palestinians. That was the point I was trying to make.
Okay. Do you see merit, though, in the closing of those tunnels?
Of course. I mean, the tunnels were sources, from Israel's perspective, they were sources of arms, they were sources of cement that created those tunnels that so threatened the Israelis this summer. So, I mean, of course, I wasn't suggesting, my God, let's open some more tunnels. It isn't a good, bad thing. It's just sort of giving you a sense of whose interests are affected. That's how I was trying to talk about it.
Okay.
One last question of Pat.
Okay. Yes, an article that you wrote in January of 2009.
Can you put the mic near you?
Yes. An article you wrote after the first Gaza war in January 2009 entitled Parsing the Gains of the Gaza War really stuck with me, and I've quoted it to a number of people since then. And in that article, you referred to an Israeli phrase that's loosely translated to be, the boss has lost it. Mm-hmm. And it goes on to be described as, this phrase means that if our civilians are attacked by you, we are not going to respond in proportion, but we will use all means we have to cause you such damage that you will think twice in the future, said a man named Giora Island, a former national security advisor. That, to me, it was an acknowledgement that Israel pursues a deliberate strategy of waging war on civilians. Could you comment on that?
I could. So the phrase that was heard quite a lot in 08-09 is the Hebrew phrase, Baal habayit ishtagea. And the idea is that in a certain way, it refers to, it's a sort of a thing in shops, right? Like, you can buy a washing machine for $1, the boss has gone crazy, come on in. It was that's where it comes from. But the argument here was to say, you should know that if you think we are going to be easy to deal with, if you come after us, no, we're going to make life very unpleasant for you. So I don't think that's the same thing as saying that we're going to slaughter civilians, which is the conclusion you have drawn. There is no doubt in my mind that civilians were killed, that some civilians were killed. I mean, we all know civilians were killed. There's no doubt in my mind that some deaths of civilians was due to a lack of care on the part of Israelis who decided they were going to go do something and it wasn't going to stop them. And I'm certain that there must have been some along the lines of what you said. The question is proportions, and I don't have an answer to that. I don't think that Israel went in to kill civilians. I don't think so. But I do think that the gap between what a civilian is and what is someone who's related to the security services, that the way they judge it would be different from the way you would judge it. For example, in that 08-09 war, Israel took down the parliament building, every ministry. They bombed a ceremony of 250 police cadets, and their argument was they're all part of the Hamas infrastructure. And my own sense is that is an illegitimate use of the phrase Hamas infrastructure.
Enjoyed it very much. Thank you.